whispering about voodoo. Specifically, we're whispering about Louisiana Voodoo. Now, I've had multiple comments telling me to read about voodoo. Now, voodoo is really popular and is practiced throughout the entire world, and there are multiple versions of voodoo, and I didn't exactly know what to choose. So, I went at semi-random and I chose Louisiana Voodoo. If you would like me to read about another type, please tell me in the comments and tell me what specific type you would like me to read about. I'm happy to continue to read about this, and I'm happy to move on to other subjects. Now, before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that I can't pronounce everything correctly. So, if you know that I have pronounced something incorrectly in this video, please leave a comment below. Please leave a comment below and tell me what I pronounced incorrectly. Now we're on to Louisiana Voodoo, also known as the New Orleans Voodoo, and it describes a set of spiritual beliefs and practices developed from the traditions of the African diaspora in Louisiana. It is sometimes referred to as Mississippi Valley Voodoo when referring to its historic popularity and development in Greater Mississippi Valley. It is a cultural form of the Afro-American religions developed by the West and Central African populations of the U.S. state of Louisiana. Voodoo is one of the many incarnations of African-based spiritual folkways rooted in West African Dahamean voodoo. Voodoo's liturgical language is Louisiana Creole, one of the two main heritage languages, the other being Louisiana French, of the Louisiana Creole people. It became syncretized with the Catholic and Francophone culture of New Orleans as a result of the African cultural oppression in the region as part of the Atlantic slave trade. Louisiana Voodoo is often confused with Haitian Voodoo, a deep southern voodoo, but while related to these forms of a religion, it is a belief system of its own. So they're trying to say that voodoo with a H and voodoo with a V are different things. It differs from Haitian Voodoo in its emphasis upon gris, voodoo queens, use of voodoo paraphernalia, and Le Grand Zombie. It was through Louisiana Voodoo that such terms as gris, a Wolof term, and voodoo dolls were introduced into the American lexicon. Now we move to its history. Voodoo was brought to French Louisiana during the colonial period by enslaved sub-Saharan Africans from West Africa. From 1719 to 1731, the majority of African captives were brought to and enslaved in Louisiana were Fon people from what is now Benin. Citation needed. Other groups such as the Bambara, Mandinka, Wolof, Iwi, Fulb, Fon, Dahamean, Yoruba, Nago, Chamba, Congo, Ibo, Ado, Horza, and Sango Hall also brought their cultural practices, languages, and religious beliefs rooted in spirit and ancestor worship. All of the groups contributed to the development of Louisiana Voodoo. Their knowledge of herbs, poisons, and the ritual creation creation of charms and amulets intended to protect oneself or harm others became key elements of Louisiana Voodoo. Many Fon were also taken as slaves to the French colony of Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean Sea. Louisiana Voodoo has existed since the early 1700s. The enslaved community quickly outnumbered white European colonists. The French colony was not a stable society where the enslaved sub-Saharan Africans arrived, and the newly arrived sub-Saharan Africans dominated the slave community. According to a census of 1731 to 1732, the ratio of enslaved sub-Saharan Africans to European settlers was more than 2 to 1. A relatively small number of colonists were planters and slaveholders, owners of sugar plantations with work that required large labour forces. Because the Africans were held in large groups, relatively isolated from interaction with whites, the preservation of African indigenous practices and culture was enabled. In the Upper South and other parts of British colonial America, slave families were usually divided. Large numbers of African slaves who were once closely related by family or community were sent to different plantations. However, in southern Louisiana, families, cultures, and languages were kept more than intact than in the north. This allowed cultural traditions, languages, and religious practices of the slaves to continue there. Under the French Code and the influence of Catholicism, officials nominally recognized family groups, of prohibiting the sale of slave children away from their families if younger than age 14. They promoted the man-made legend of Wake-Tungo of the enslaved populations. The high mortality of the slave trade brought its survivors together with a sense of solidarity and initiation. The absence of fragmentation in the enslaved community, along with the kinship system produced by the bond created by the difficulties of slavery, resulted in a coherent, functional, well-integrated, autonomous, and self-confident enslaved community. The practice of making and wearing charms and amulets for protection, healing, or the harm of others was a key aspect of early Louisiana Voodoo. The Uanga, a charm used to poison an enemy, contained the toxic roots of the Figua maudit tree, brought from Africa and preserved in Louisiana. The ground-up root was combined with other elements such as bones, nails, roots, holy water, holy candles, holy incense, holy bread, or crucifixes. The administrator of the ritual frequently invoked protection from Jehovah as a precaution against uprisings. Unlike their Haitian counterparts, the slaves in Louisiana did not rebel in great numbers against their slave masters. Instead, voodoo followers used amulets and charms in their daily lives. The people used them mainly for healing, protection, guidance, and to keep a connection with their loved ones. Some charms were used to hurt their enemies and involved the deceptions of curses. Now let's talk about famous characters in voodoo. Influence of voodoo leaders. Voodoo queens, powerful female practitioners of the religion, were known to exercise great power in their communities and had the role of leading many of the ceremonial meetings and ritual dances. These drew crowds of hundreds of thousands of people. Wow, they made a living through the selling and administering of amulets or gris-gris charms and magical powders, as well as spells and charms that guaranteed to cure ailments, grant desires, and confound or destroy one's enemies. Their power and influence were widespread and largely incontestable. It was recognized by journalists, judges, criminals, and citizens alike. These women of African and Creole descent emerged as powerful leaders in a society that upheld an oppressive slave regime and dichotomy of freedom between blacks and whites. Their influence was felt in black and white circles alike, partly due to the early history of the city, in which a shortage of white women resulted in a high number of interracial liaisons. As in other French colonial communities, a class of free people of colour developed who were given specific rights and, in New Orleans, acquired property and education. Free women of colour had a relatively high amount of influence, particularly those who were spiritual leaders. In addition, the religious traditions in West and Central Africa, from where many voodoo customs are derived, provided for women to exercise extraordinary power. Now we move to Mary Laveau. Among the 15 voodoo queens in neighbourhoods scattered around the 19th century New Orleans, Mary Laveau was known as the Voodoo Queen, the most eminent and powerful of them all. Her religious rite on the shore of Lake Pontchartrain on St. John's Eve in 1874 attracted some 12,000 black and white New Orleanians. It was said the politicians, lawyers, businessmen, wealthy planters all came to her consult before making an important financial or business-related decision. She also saw the poor and enslaved. Although her help seemed non-discriminatory, she may have favoured enslaved servants. Her most influential, affluent customers, runaway slaves, credited their successful escapes to Laveau's powerful charms. Once the news of her powers spread, she dominated the other voodoo leaders of New Orleans. Also, a Catholic, Laveau encouraged her followers to attend Catholic Mass. Her influence contributed to the adoption of Catholic practices into the voodoo belief system. Mary Laveau is remembered for her skill and compassion for the less fortunate. Laveau also gained influence over her clientele by her day job as a hairdresser, which gave her intimate knowledge of the gossip in town. Her customers also came to buy voodoo dolls, potions, gris-gris bags, and the like. Her influence continues in the city. In the 21st century, her gravesite in the oldest cemetery is a major tourist attraction. Believers of voodoo offer gifts here and pray to her spirit. Across the street from the cemetery where Laveau is buried, offerings of pound cake are left to the statue of Saint Expedite. These offerings are believed to expedite the favours asked of the Voodoo Queen. Saint Expedite represents the spirit standing between life and death. The chapel where the statue stands was once used only for holding funerals. Mary LaVille continues to be a central figure of Louisiana Voodoo and of New Orleans culture. Gamblers shout her name when throwing dice, and multiple tales of sightings of the Voodoo Queen have been told. Now we move to Dr. John, also known by many other names such as Bayou John and Prince John, was born in Senegal and kidnapped as a slave before becoming a prominent Voodoo king in the late 19th century in New Orleans. He brought the knowledge of the craft from his home country, Senegal. He joined an already prominent Voodoo community that existed in New Orleans since the early 1700s, developed by African slave groups such as Bambara, Mandinka, Wolof, Iwi, Foub, Nard, Mina, Fon, Yoruba, Chamba, Congo, Ibo, Aldo, Nohausa, and Sango. Previous natives of Senegal were already enslaved in New Orleans by 1720. Through Dr. John's work in the medicinal aspects of voodoo, he gained a reputation for being an excellent healer. Some reports went as far to state that he had the ability to resuscitate patients on the verge of death through his rituals. This is one of the earliest voodoo accounts of reanimation, leading to the myth of zombies in Louisiana. However, it has been reported that Dr. John confessed to friends that his magic was a sham. He had been known to laugh, writes Robert Tallant in The Voodoo in New Orleans in 1946, page 39, when he told of selling a gullible white woman a small jar of starch and water for $5. Moving to Fred Staten, born in 1937 in Haiti, Fred Staten moved with his family to New Orleans as an infant, where he was raised by his grandparents, also of Haitian descent. His grandfather was a practicing Baptist minister. When Fred was young, his grandparents told him that he was of royal African descent and had supernatural abilities. His true name was revealed to be Prince Kayama. Papa John Bayou taught him the ways of Haitian Voodoo. As of a young man, Staten made many trips to voodoo communities in Haiti and the United States to learn more of the art. Staten, or Prince, became Papa Midnight and settled permanently in New Orleans in the 1970s. He developed his chicken man persona, performing nightclub acts expressing his strong spiritual connection with God and voodoo. His performance included dancing, magic, and biting the head of a live chicken and drinking its blood. Interesting. I probably don't condone that. He attracted thousands of followers, but some other voodoo practitioners saw him simply as a showman. He was worshipped as a voodoo priest until his mysterious death. In early 1998, his ashes were donated to the Voodoo Spiritual Temple. Now let's take a little bit of a look at their beliefs and practices. Singing is among important rituals as part of voodoo worship. Songs have been passed down orally for hundreds of years. Songs would be accompanied by patting, clapping, and foot stomping, but not drum playing unless it was part of the weekly public ceremony in Congo Square in New Orleans during slavery times. Songs are sung to give descriptions of personalities for the deities, such as their names, likes and dislikes, origin, responsibilities, strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes the songs are sung in address to the deities and sometimes as if the deities themselves were speaking or singing. Many songs mirror tunes of the Catholic Church as well as associate the Catholic saints with African deities. There are only two ways a new song would be added to the voodoo repertoire. The first is if someone has heard the song in a dream, and this is believed to be the spirit's revelation. A second instance is as if a person is in a possessed trance and asks the people around them to sing it and memorize it, when it is considered to come straight from a spirit. There are 4 phases to a voodoo ritual, all identifiable by the song being sung: preparation, invocation, possession, and farewell. The songs are used to open the gate between the deities and the human world and invite the spirits to possess someone. And finally, we take a little bit of a more in-depth look at voodoo in society. This section is a little bit longer. And now we take a little bit of a look at voodoo in society, talking now about its commercialization. During the 1930s, voodoo went underground as New Orleans became an increasingly popular tourist destination. Voodoo was portrayed exotically in the 1932 feature film White Zombie. A popular misconception developed that the principal elements of voodoo are hexing and sticking pins into dolls. At this time, some exploited the tradition, making a business of superstitions and for selling fake potions, powders, and gris-gris. In the early 21st century, voodoo has become part of the tourist attractions in New Orleans. Commercial interests have sought to capitalize on popular interest in the religion. Shops selling charms, gris-gris, candles, and powders cater to both tourists and practitioners. The New Orleans Historic Voodoo Museum houses numerous artifacts and provides daily tours of the museum, the St. Louis Cemetery, and the French Quarter, New Orleans. The museum also provides spiritual services including matrimony blessings, marriage ceremonies, consultations, and other rituals. In August of 1995, voodoo practitioners held a ritual in Bywater to drive away crack cocaine abuse, vulgarities, prostitution, and assaults. Interesting. Louisiana Voodoo in the media. While media content exists that portrays voodoo practitioners with accuracy, many popular novels like Voodoo Season and Voodoo Dreams by Joel Parker Rhodes, and horror movies such as White Zombie, I Walked with the Zombie, The Serpent and the Rainbow, Voodoo Dawn, or Hoodoo Fort Voodoo are misrepresentations of actual voodoo traditions. Voodoo is central to the plot of the 1973 James Bond film Live and Let Die. The main Bond villain, Dr. Kenga, uses the fear of voodoo to scare locals away from his poppy fields where he is cultivating opium to convert into heroin, to be given away free on the streets of New Orleans. Various references to voodoo as it has developed in popular culture, which include poisons used on tarts, shrunken heads, etc., appear throughout the film, including the rising from the dead of the secondary villain, Baron Samedi. A more recent example of voodoo being portrayed in popular media is in the well-known American TV show American Horror Story, Coven. The series focuses on witches in New Orleans and presents a group of white witches alongside a group of black witches who practice voodoo. However, there is one black woman among the ranks of the otherwise white witches known as Queenie. Her magical ability is that of a human voodoo doll. She can inflict pain on others by mutilating herself. A very interesting concept. As writer Amanda K. LeBlanc writes in her article Re-Centering Whiteness in American Horror Story, Coven disproportionately relies on violence against black bodies in order to provide horror to the audience. The show uses portrayals of voodoo to do this. It emphasizes voodoo as a violent practice, as magic drawn from the pain of others, usually white people. very interesting, and it does seem rather offensive when you think about the fact that voodoo was actually practiced as a serious religion. These misrepresentations in media can actually have quite profound impacts on a community. Especially, it can make tensions really tense if you imagine an entire community of people that are misunderstood and misrepresented can kind of build a harder tribalism and groupthink and animosity towards the outside world, and I think we have to be really careful and loving in how we portray everyone to avoid further divisions in society. Now let's keep going. The show also portrays this violence as a large part of the voodoo, as committed without empathy. Coven shows Queenie, the black voodoo witch, hurting people with her voodoo magic without remorse. Queenie uses her voodoo doll-like powers to violently attack a male customer who continuously assaulted her at the fried chicken restaurant where she worked until she sticks her hand into the deep frying oil to burn the man. The camera lingers on Queenie's smiling face. She is glad she hurt him. Queenie alone knows she caused this man's horrific burns, and while we rooted for her, her smile is menacing and threatening. The show connects voodoo to ruthless violence, contributing to the unrealistic perceptions of the African religion. A character named Mary LaVue, based on the real-life historical figure, also appears in the American Horror Story Coven as a voodoo practicing witch. Voodoo, for both her character and Queenie's, is connected to both anger and dangerous sexuality in the show. In Coven, the black women are portrayed as feminine and certainly sexual, but unlike their white counterparts, femininity and sexuality become attached to their wild animalness. A harsh critique, but it would be interesting to see what they mean in this show. For example, both of these women have sexual romantic relations with a violent black minotaur, while the show portrays the white witches as having sexual relations as well. Throughout the season, LaVue and Queenie's connections to the minotaur is their only sexual and romantic relationship. Louisiana Voodoo also featured prominently and played as a central role in the serial killing mystery in New Orleans for the 1993 video game Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers, with Mary LaVue and the other historical figures of Louisiana Voodoo mentioned in the storyline. In the 2009 Disney film The Princess and the Frog, New Orleans Voodoo depicted the story's main Disney villain, Dr. Felicia, voiced by Keith David, who is a Bokor or witch doctor. This is exemplified through his costume, his ominous presence, and the talisman he carries. Felicia turns the film's Disney prince character, Naveen, and indirectly the film's Disney princess character, Diana, into frogs. Conversely, the film's fairy godmother figure, Mama Odie, voiced by Jennifer Lewis, is a voodoo queen who only dresses in white. She has a familiar, which is kind of like a spirit animal, named Juju, a snake that serves as everything from a walking stick to a bridge, and she lives in an abandoned ship in the bayou. Now, let's talk about Louisiana Voodoo and Christianity. As a result of the fusion of Francophone culture and voodoo in Louisiana, Creoles of colour associated many voodoo spirits with the Christian saints known to preside over the same domain. Although some doctrinary leaders of each tradition believe voodoo and Catholic practices are in conflict, in popular culture both saints and spirits are believed to act as mediators, with the Catholic priest or voodoo legba presiding over the specific respective authorities. Early followers of voodoo in the United States adopted the image of the Catholic saints to represent their spirits. Other Catholic practices adopted into Louisiana Voodoo include reciting the Hail especially in the South. The religion became a viable area of discourse for white supremacists because of its subaltern existence, connections to African practices, anxieties about its connections to black conspiracy and slave rebellion, and its powerful women of colour. For example, in the 1800s, Louisiana newspapers typically portrayed voodoo practices in a negative way, with articles such as Voodoo's on the Rampage. They described rumours of animal sacrifices, zombies, and spirits, sensationalising stories of depraved acts voodoo had driven black people to commit. This portrayal of voodoo contributed to the idea that black people were superstitious primitives. Man, the racism really is complicated and goes quite deep, doesn't it? But the people here writing seem quite smart because I don't know if I would be able to linguistically or, describe the impact that would have, like saying that they were superstitious primitives. I don't know if I could have been able to form it, but the conception of that, them believing in these really depraved acts, does depict them in that way, and it is racist. And I think that's why it's important to have experts in this area be able to succinctly write and formulate ideas that you are having, but you can't say out loud yet because you haven't the skill. So, a very good job to whoever wrote that. It's quite profound. Narratives about voodoo practices also were typically used to demonstrate the threat of black and female rebellion, and were thus used as rationale for the need to regulate communities of colour. Voodoo narratives served as validation of rationalizations of white supremacy for white publics by portraying the wilderness and barbarity of people of African descent, and thus in contrast the stableness and intelligence of white people. These views were used to emphasize the terrors of black voting rights, desegregation, and interracial mixing, especially since white supremacists viewed voodoo as a symbol of the threat of Negro domination. Wow. Narratives of voodoo also helped to make black criminality an accepted social fact, and to create and solidify perceptions of black men as primitive, animalistic, and often as rapists, feeding into arguments for black men's lack of suffrage and legal segregation, as well as excusing political violence in the South for years to come. However, even after black male enfranchisement was achieved, voodoo narratives often emphasized the dangerous intermingling of white women and black men in ritual spaces, continuing to paint men of color as rapists. This perception was one of the central arguments provided for continued segregation and repressive violence. Later, this authentication of black criminality contributed to justifications for the mass incarceration, labor exploitation, and regulation of female sexuality that shaped the Jim Crow era social order. It makes you a bit sad, doesn't it? But I think it's very important to talk about this type of thing because, of course, education is the way out. I think personally, in almost every situation, education, served in its various forms, is the way to provide people the medium to evolve, transform, and change both themselves and society. Now we go to hoodoo. Many superstitions also related to the practice of hoodoo developed within the voodoo tradition in Louisiana. While these superstitions are not central to the voodoo faith, their emergence has been partly a result of voodoo tradition in New Orleans and have since influenced it significantly. In hoodoo herbalism, the cure-all was very popular among followers. All was a hoodoo mixture that could solve all problems. Hoodoo's herbal healing system included a variety of ingredients for cure-alls. One recipe was to mix Jimson weed with sulfur and honey. The mixture was placed example of sympathetic magic. Contrary to popular belief, hoodoo dolls are usually used to bless and have no power to curse. According to Jerry Gandolfo, the purpose of sticking pins in the doll is not to cause pain in the associated person, but rather to pin a picture of a person or a name to the doll, which traditionally represents a spirit. Ah, interesting. The Gris Gris is performed from one of four categories: love, power and domination, luck and finance, and uncrossing. Hoodoo practitioners have used different tools throughout the history of the practice to solve their customers' ailments. The generic name for the items is Gris Gris. Talismans, amulets, voodoo charms, spells, or incantations capable of warding off evil and bringing good luck to oneself, or of bringing misfortune to another, as defined by Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Examples include five-finger grass, dragon blood sticks, Dixie love perfume, and brimstone. Explanations in a 1946 book said the five-finger grass was a leaf split into 5 sections. The belief was that if one hung in one's house, it would ward off any evil. Dragon blood sticks were said to bring good luck in money, business, and love. Keeping a stick close on a person was said to bring luck. Dixie love perfume was noted for a fragrance to encourage romance. Brimstone is used to keep away evil spirits and counteract spells cast on households, and was burned in rooms needing to be deodorized. These were traditionally available in local shops. The user often had to take additional steps in a process before using such items, such as washing their hands in 2-Jack's extract. Only hoodoo shops have been known to sell these supplies. Many voodoo practitioners were believed to be afraid of these hoodoo items. In American South, hoodoo is mainly practiced by Protestant Christians. Weird. That's interesting, and I wonder the history behind that. Now let's talk about voodoo and spiritualism. New Orleans spiritualist churches honor the spirit of the Black Hawk, a Sauk war chief who was influential in the early 19th century Illinois and Wisconsin. The New Orleans spiritualist religion is a blend of spiritualism, voodoo, Catholicism, and Pentecostalism. The voodoo-influenced spiritualist churches that survived in New Orleans are the result of syncretism of these or other spiritual practices. Very interesting. This was a little bit of a longer whispering Wikipedia, but I have no problem with that. I like reading these, and I like learning a lot. And using these headphones and focusing on providing you with some more quality ASMR is definitely something that I'm happy to do. So thank you so much for watching. If you haven't, and if you're still here, I would love to invite you to like the video, to subscribe, and to join me for the next video sometime soon. I post a video every single day on this channel, and I'm always happy to make more. If you have any suggestions for what I should read about next, please leave it in the comments below. I love reading Wikipedia because it forces me to stumble upon stuff that I really